Hello and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. This week's guest has recently returned from the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific, where she's been continuing her studies in marine microplastic pollution. Dr. Ceri Lewis is an associate professor in marine biology from the University of Exeter and is involved in the Convex Seascape Survey. The 5-year research programme is dedicated to filling in our knowledge gaps on how the ocean and climate are connected, with the aim of informing effective action against the climate crisis. She's a key member of an international team of biologists and oceanographers studying ocean acidification in the Canadian High Arctic and took part in the Catlin Arctic Survey expeditions in 2010 and 2011. Ceri's current research stars a cast of fascinating marine invertebrates like sponges, corals, bluebottles, worms, sea urchins, starfish, sea cucumbers and crustaceans who make their home both in and on the seabed. They range in size from microscopic organisms like tiny marine worms to ones which are several meters in length and have an amazing diversity of form, which I'm dying to hear more about. And we'll hear about Ceri's mission, sharing her findings with literally millions of UK and international school children. Ceri, welcome to the Convex Conversation. It's an absolute treat, actually, to have you on.
Yeah, hi, and thank you so much for giving me another excuse to talk about worms.
Well, as you know, I heard you speak at a Convex Seascape Survey event in London about your research and the wonders of the creatures who live on and in the seabed and in the mud. And I knew when I sat there in the audience that we had to invite you onto the podcast. You just brought the whole subject to life, Ceri.
Oh, thank you. Any excuse to talk about these fascinating creatures. And I think they're one of these really overlooked groups of organisms. So I love being able to make people more aware of these fascinating animals.
I was on the edge of my seat actually listening, and I know that we're going to hear some great stories today with some good examples, hopefully. But let's start off with you telling us a bit about the marine invertebrates that probably none of us really think about that much in our daily life and some of the intriguing species that you study.
Well, absolutely. So I work on a range of different marine invertebrates. Those are the smaller animals at the bottom of the marine food chain. Worms are just one of many groups of marine invertebrates. People are probably a bit more familiar with things like mussels or starfish, but there's thousands of different worms that live in the marine environment as well. They're not just important bottom of the food chains being food for larger fish or birds. They also do some really important jobs in our marine ecosystems. They're doing things like nutrient recycling, providing these important what we call ecosystem functions. It just means they do jobs to support a healthy marine environment. And I've spent a lot of my research career trying to understand these jobs, but also then look at how changes in the sea due to human activity might be affecting some of these important roles.
Tell us a bit about worms. And am I right in thinking they're known as serpents of the sea?
I hadn't heard that. I always try and use the analogy of earthworms. I think most people now are aware of how important earthworms are in your garden for keeping your soil healthy, for making your crops go properly. And marine worms are often doing that same job in our marine mud, the sediment at the bottom of the sea. They're turning over vast volumes of mud with their burrowing activity. That facilitates a lot of these processes that recycle nutrients, releasing those nutrients or fertilizing the ocean again to allow more primary production, more photosynthesis to keep the ocean functioning. And they can be a fascinating group of creatures. They can, as you said, be very small. You get some really big worms. Some worms are 3 meters long. They can be beautiful colours. Some of them are really iridescent pink and purple colours. So they're not just doing this important job. I think they're actually just really cool as well.
What are the coolest invertebrates, do you think, that you've studied or that you do study?
I mean, I love them all, but I think one of my favourites are the ones that look a bit like bobbit worms. Bobbit worms were featured in some of the Blue Planet programmes, so people might have seen these worms that kind of launch themselves out of the mud. What looked like on the TV, like this massive set of jaws. They're actually about the size of your finger, so they're not quite as ferocious as they looked on the TV. But they're actually incredible predators. And there's a wonderful story that I tell all my students about all the time about an aquarium here in the southwest in Torquay, where all the fish in the aquarium tank were slowly disappearing with time, and they had no idea what was causing these fish to disappear. They were worried it might be disease. And it turned out there was a tiny larval worm, baby worm, that had come in with the seawater that had then grown into this massive predator in the bottom of the tank, and it was slowly eating all of the fish, which they eventually found when the tank was completely empty. They emptied the tank and they just found this fat, happy worm in the bottom.
And the giant squid, I think, is the largest marine invertebrate. They can be absolutely huge. Have you ever seen a giant squid carrying
I
your
have
work.
never been so lucky to see those are big oceanic predators. You generally have to have gone out on a submarine to see those, and I've never been that lucky. But I've spent lots of time snorkeling around the UK, chasing their smaller cousins, the cuttlefish that you get here in the UK, and they are beautiful, fascinating creatures.
Wow. How critical are these marine invertebrates in giving us an understanding of what's happening in terms of warming and also pollution? I'm guessing actually that answer could probably fill the rest of the podcast.
Absolutely. But a lot of the work that I do at Exeter University is looking at different stresses such as warming, acidification, pollution. You can pick a species that provides you with a good indicator for all of those things. For example, for pollution, we quite often use mussels as an indicator species because they filter vast volumes of water in their feeding behaviour. They can take, I think it's about 8 litres an hour through their gills. They filter out and therefore concentrate anything that's in the water. And so by just sampling a few mussels, you can start to get a really good picture of what contaminants might be in that environment. And we can see all sorts of indicators of change across the bottom of the food chain, which obviously will then cascade up to the higher predators, the fish, the larger vertebrates. And it's much easier to study these smaller animals.
And of course, one of the things you focus on is microplastics and the biological impacts of microplastics on marine invertebrates. How is the studying going on that front? And what have you found so far?
Well, unfortunately, we basically find microplastics everywhere we look for them now. We find them in every stomach of every marine species that we look for. We find microplastic pollution at the bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean. And it's not just a marine problem. It's in the air that we're breathing. It's in our water. It's in our beer. We're finding microplastics everywhere. But this research really started with the oceans. It's where we first realized that this was a contaminant, a pollution problem that we should be thinking about. And so much of our understanding of what happens when you accidentally ingest microplastics comes from these early studies on marine invertebrates. Mussels are a great species for looking at this. And so we've been understanding what happens if you ingest microplastics. Certainly what we find with the marine animals we've looked at, they're not acutely toxic in the same way as something like a pesticide or oil pollution might be. But we absolutely see impacts on the health and the functioning, so the way these animals do their jobs in the environment, from having plastics present in their diet. They eat less of their normal food. We see all of these irritation, inflammation responses, a little bit like what we see with asbestos in humans. It's those kind of inflammatory responses that then impact lots of other health parameters in these animals. Understanding what that means for human health is much more complicated, and those studies are only just now starting to come through in the sort of the more medical fields. But certainly these plastics are a real area of concern. Certainly all of the data we have from the studies in our oceans are that the numbers are increasing and have been increasing sort of exponentially over time. And that kind of matches the global production of plastic. If you look at how much plastic we make globally, that is still increasing. At the moment, we make more plastic every year than there are people on the planet in terms of the weight of plastic we make. An awful lot of that, about 50%, is for single-use items that we use for about 15 minutes and then we throw it away. And obviously plastic is a product that will last for hundreds of years. So it's deeply worrying that we're still not changing that production and that behaviour, even though that we know this is now a major environmental pollutant and is accumulating all across the world.
And of course, this means it's very much in our food chain, doesn't it? When we eat fish and mussels and crustaceans.
And the thing to remember is that actually with most of our seafood, we take out the guts before we eat them. But there are a few things we do eat whole, like mussels and oysters. And so certainly mussels and oysters will go through lots of decontamination before they make it to your plate. And most of the plastic will be removed in those processes. But we're learning more and more about the even smaller bits of plastic that we can't see. And those are probably accumulating in the tissues of the animals, which won't then come out in those processes. But again, we're only just learning how to measure those. And so our understanding of those much, much smaller particles is still at quite an early stage, but we know they're there.
And can you give us a sense, Ceri, of how you actually study some of the tiny creatures, what your work involves, whether you're snorkeling on the seabed and collecting some samples and going back to the... I mean, I've got no idea of what the actual studying involves.
No, and it's a great question. We use a range of different approaches. We both go out into the ocean, but we also have at Exeter University, we have a wonderful research aquarium where we can mimic any kind of environment and then bring the animals in. And because there are so many different factors in the oceans, such as warming and pollution and things that will affect what we're interested in measuring, by removing animals from those complex environments and putting them in much more controlled laboratory conditions in our aquarium, we can be much more certain that the thing we're looking at is what we're measuring. So you keep everything else the same, and then you just change, for example, how much plastic is in a tank, and you can measure an animal's response to that. It's not like an aquarium that you would go to visit the sharks, the London Aquarium, for example. It's very much a research facility, but it enables us to ask these questions in real detail and understand what's happening better.
Another area that you're also focused on is looking at marine invertebrates and how they adapt and survive in a changing and increasingly polluted and presumably increasingly warming ocean. How is that work going, and what are you looking at the moment on that front?
Well, at the moment, we're focusing a little bit more on the processes that animals are involved in that control the carbon fluxes through the environment. So we know that every process that an animal does will be temperature sensitive. We know that the ocean is warming, and actually the data from the last 2 years really shows us that the ocean is warming at a slightly more accelerated rate than some of the models. And we've had 2 exceptionally warm years globally for sea surface temperatures. And so the focus is kind of more looking now at how can we use what we call nature-based solutions, using the capacity of natural environments to take up carbon, and understand how we can support those environments to take up as much carbon as possible to try and do something about these warming temperatures, these increasing carbon dioxide emissions, mitigating, if you like, the climate change impacts. And so what we're doing in the Convex project now is much more around how do we protect those carbon stores, and how are the animals that live in these environments influencing these carbon flux processes.
And what have you found?
Well, it's really early days. At the moment, we're very much at the sort of collecting data and analysing it. These things take quite a long time to get to the kind of the key findings. But what we've been looking at is this range of different species that live in the mud. And certainly, I think mud is kind of having its climate moment at the moment. It's one of these underrepresented environments in terms of the research effort to date. Most people focus on things like, temperate forests or rainforests in terms of carbon stores, or seagrass and mangroves for the coastal, what we call blue carbon, which is the carbon stores in the marine environment. Whereas actually mud on the bottom of the ocean is probably the biggest habitat in terms of these carbon stores. There are millions of tons of carbon in these muds that we know much less about. And so that's what we're looking at. My particular role in the project is, what does a worm burrowing into that mud do for those carbon fluxes? What we're finding so far is that we get real differences in the influence of the different species on these carbon fluxes, depending on the size of the animal, the type of animal, how it burrows into the mud. And so we're basically putting bits of jigsaw puzzle together to look at what happens when you have all of these animals together. But we're a little early in that journey yet to be able to tell you what it all means overall.
So before we were concerned with climate change, Ceri, did Mother Nature design the invertebrates that perhaps live in and on the seabed to be the mitigating factor for carbon? And is that one of their roles, that they protect these carbon stores naturally, and we've disrupted that by overfishing or damaging the seabed?
I think you have to think of it all as it's a functioning ecosystem, and there are processes that release carbon. Respiration, breathing, releases carbon. Feeding takes it up, moves it around. And so it was a system that was nicely in balance before we started disturbing it. And what we're trying to get a sense of is, when you disturb it, how are you removing that natural capacity for taking up carbon? And are there certain species that are more important than others that need better protection? Are we not protecting some that really matter? At the moment, our sea floor is not particularly well protected unless there's a pretty feature like a reef or a seagrass. We're not very good at protecting mud. And this is one of the key questions we're asking in this project, really, is, well, should we be doing a better job of protecting just mud? I say just mud, it's not just mud, obviously, it's full of amazing creatures, but I think it's not protected as well as it could be. And we are really trying to understand how we could protect it better and what that would mean for carbon.
And how, well, I was just going to say, probably you might not be able to answer this because obviously it takes so long to find these answers and you've got to analyse all the research. But is there a general broad view of how we could protect that seabed and the carbon stores better?
Well, I think the process we're most worried about is bottom trawling for fishing, which really churns up that mud. It will kill an awful lot of the animals in that top 10 to 20 centimetres of mud. That process of trawling is really destructive. A lot of these animals are quite soft-bodied, and so they're very easily damaged by these trawling processes. But it also then removes the kind of the stability of that mud. And as mud is moving around more, it's more likely to be releasing carbon rather than storing it. But we don't have a great amount of data on just how quickly seabed recovers from that, or just how much carbon is lost in those processes. That's one of the key questions we're looking at in this project.
And is another key area not just what as a society we're emitting with bigger use of cars and things like that, but also what's happening to those really valuable stores below the ocean? Because presumably we don't want that carbon being released back into the atmosphere.
No, but that's another one of the key questions we're really looking at, is where does that carbon go when the bottom is disturbed? And it's probably not all going back into the atmosphere. So it possibly isn't a net flux back into the atmosphere, but it probably is affecting the ability to draw down from the atmosphere. And the ocean is one of our biggest carbon stores. And again, that's probably something a lot of people don't really think about. They don't think about how much of global carbon is taken up by just these natural processes in the ocean. And the more we disturb those natural processes in the ocean, the less capacity the ocean has to take up that carbon. And that all adds up to what's happening with climate change.
I remember interviewing your colleague, Dr. Callum Roberts, for the podcast. And one of the things I've quoted so many times is he said, if you're in space and you look down at Earth, if you took into account the depth of the ocean's 97% of the planet. And when you look at it like that, Ceri, it really could be the solution, couldn't it, to help us get across this awful climate crisis that we're faced with right now?
I think it's certainly a vital part of our tools in tackling climate change. I do think we can't just rely on nature-based solutions and sort of, we have to look at how we are releasing carbon dioxide as well. So I think we need multiple tools to tackle climate change, but certainly a healthy functioning ocean is absolutely vital to any of these things happening.
In your day-to-day life, given how aware you are of microplastics and the effect of plastic, are you very careful about your single use?
I certainly try to be, but it's very hard. And it's very hard because of the way in which all of our systems are designed. I can't remember the last time I had a single-use coffee cup anywhere. I take my reusable cups everywhere I go. But when you're food shopping, it can be incredibly difficult to avoid plastic containers. So one of the other projects that we're involved in and that I get quite excited about is coming up with alternative materials and testing whether they're actually better. So things like bioplastics, but bioplastics that genuinely break down. There's all sorts of things that get called bioplastics. Not all of them actually compost well or don't release other things. So we're working with some wonderful companies who are developing green chemistry for genuine bioplastics that will break down basically back into water and carbon dioxide rather than having any sort of microplastics left when they rot. And looking at whether those are safer, because there are certain things that it's really hard not to have plastic for, like some of the things you might buy in supermarkets.
Those yellow and green sponges that a lot of us use to clean our saucepans with. Again, on the podcast, we featured a lovely lady who founded Seep, and they make natural sponges out of loofah and bamboo and materials like that. And so far, I think, say they've got I think it's 1 million of those sponges out of landfill because of the sales. It is interesting. There's some fantastic companies doing work on that front. You've made me feel guilty about my coffee cup because I have a takeaway coffee every day, and I do have a keep cup and I never remember to take it. So.
I have several because I regularly forget them, but I've got one everywhere now, so that's the solution.
If only coffee shops just stopped doing them. We'd all just buy one, wouldn't we? And then we'd turn up with our reusable
But honestly, the biggest single-use items globally are coffee cups, plastic bottles and carrier bags. And those are all easily replaced. It's the harder things like wrapping of your blueberries. That's the one I always feel guilty about. But I do like blueberries.
One of my bugbears is supermarkets and plastic bags. I try and turn up either with my recycled plastic bags or fabric ones. But while they are still next to the till and you're able to actually purchase one, people will still purchase them. If there were only fabric ones to buy and you literally had to turn up with your fabric bag or a plastic bag you just keep reusing. There's a lot of things like that would make a huge difference, I think. Anyway, I'll get off my little platform.
Having just come back from Galapagos, this is one of the places where we've been studying this plastic pollution. And Galapagos is obviously famous for its unique biodiversity. It's a remote set of volcanic islands in the middle of the Pacific, about 1,000 kilometres away from the nearest industrial city. And yet what we find on those beaches are other people's waste basically washing up in this habitat. It's brought in by the ocean currents. There's this one place that we've been working where you step off the boat. It's this beautiful white sand. sea lions and turtles and sharks all around you. And then you step onto the sand and it crunches because actually there's an entire carpet of plastic bags caught under the sand. And it took us hours to pull them all out when we were there working on it. And that's coming from totally other parts of the world, washing up in the ocean currents and littering this beautiful paradise.
Gosh, that's awful. I was just going to mention the Galapagos to you, actually. Tell me a bit about what you were up to this time. I know it's not your first visit, is it?
No, this was actually my 5th visit to Galapagos. And I mean, it just blows my mind every time I go there. It really is a biodiversity paradise. Just one snorkel I did when I jumped in and the first thing I saw was 3 sharks right in front of me. And sharks are indicators of really healthy functioning ecosystems. They're the top predators. You only find them in big numbers when there's plenty of food. Galapagos is actually one of the sharkiest parts of the planet because it's a well-protected area. It is really carefully looked after. But unfortunately, marine protected areas don't stop plastic coming in on the currents or other contaminants coming in on these ocean currents. So we've been part of a big 5-year program, really trying to understand how the plastic is coming in, where it's going, how it's impacting the marine ecosystem there, but also starting to look at what we can do about it. We've been working with all sorts of really inspiring people. Most of the plastic comes in from the mainland, from mainland Ecuador and Peru. And so we've been working with the people who are sort of modelling the flow of plastics on the mainland, how they're coming down the rivers, how we might be able to stop some of that. We're working with a company building these sort of barriers that go across the river to stop the plastic entering the ocean in the first place, looking at how you can replace some of these plastic bottles. There's no safe drinking water in Galapagos. So the tourists that come bring plastic bottles with them because they want water. What can we do about that? So it's been a really fantastic project and slightly sobering to be in such a beautiful place and to see all this plastic, but mostly inspiring because there's so much energy behind sorting out this problem.
How does it impact the ecosystem there?
Well, we find it everywhere. Certainly the larger charismatic species, the sea lions, we find them with plastic bags stuck around their necks. The turtles are ingesting them. And those species are probably, experiencing real damage from that plastic. An awful lot of effort goes into looking after them and rescuing them when they're found caught up in nets and things. But certainly they find a lot of turtles washing up dead with really full stomachs full of plastic. For the smaller animals, again, it's the same responses we see in our aquarium. It's much harder to see that when you go in the field, but we know if you're ingesting plastic, you're ingesting less of your food, you're growing less, you're doing less of these important ecosystem jobs. But we find plastic literally everywhere that we look for it, even somewhere as special and beautiful as Galapagos. By going there and working on this project, we've kind of been working really closely with the Galapagos National Park. What they're doing is now really targeting beach cleans. They're doing much more work to sort of stop the plastic coming off the tourist boats, putting policies in place to reduce the amount that people can bring with them when they come to Galapagos. There's a lot of real energy with the local people to tackle this problem.
Is there an effort as well to find some way of providing clean drinking water there too? Because it sounds like if everybody who's visiting needs to bring plastic bottles, there's a lot of plastic there. Could there be anything done on those islands to provide clean water?
Yeah, so it's not something I've been working on directly, but I certainly know there's lots of people looking at how they might tackle that better. You can't buy a plastic Coke bottle in Galapagos anymore. You can only buy the glass bottles, and all of the shops you buy them from have return schemes and you get a deposit back when you return your bottle. So there is progress on tackling those plastic bottles, but I think the water one is a slightly trickier challenge.
Ceri, give me a flavour of what it's like coming face to face with a shark. And are they sharks? Are they fairly friendly sharks when you're snorkeling in the Galapagos?
Certainly I'm always very excited to see. And I've snorkeled in other parts of the world where you rarely see a shark because they're not such healthy ecosystems. So to be somewhere so full of sharks just feels like a real treat. And I always just think they're these wondrous, magical creatures. I've never been nervous of one, but most of the sharks that I've seen have been the smaller white tip and black tip sharks. And little baby black tips are a bit like puppies. They're very cute. And, they swim between your legs and they're just really lovely. But also in Galapagos, you do get these wonderful kind of magical scalloped hammerheads. It's famous for these hammerhead aggregations that you get there. And I have been lucky enough to dive with them. And then you just feel like you're surrounded by these mythical creatures almost. They're so beautiful. I don't find them scary, but I can imagine that they might be a bit intimidating to some people.
And they are so important to the ecosystem. And you said there, I think they're an indication, aren't they, of how healthy the ocean is, etc. Why is the shark the key species to indicate how healthy the ocean is?
It's about having a balanced ecosystem. You need top predators to keep your what we call mesograzers in control. So there are fish that graze. They graze the seagrass, for example, or they might graze a coral reef. And if nothing is eating them, they can get out of control. And so having your top apex predator there keeps the rest of the ecosystem balanced. But sharks are obviously bigger, they're more easily fished, and they're regularly overfished for things like their fins. And so they are more vulnerable to being overfished than perhaps some of the other species. So they are quite often the first thing to get lost from an ecosystem when it's being heavily exploited. So an ecosystem that is really well protected generally has sharks there. And then you just see the ecosystem working as it should. Everything's in balance. You still get your seagrass growing properly because nothing's overgrazing it. Or you have your kelp if it's not a seagrass bed that's in check because there's balanced food chain being controlled by those top predators.
As a scientist, is it particularly exciting being in the Galapagos? When you think that it was the Galapagos Islands, wasn't it, that inspired Charles Darwin's theory of evolution back in the 1800s, and his observation of species almost makes the hairs on the back of my arm stand up when I'm not a scientist.
It's such an honour and a treat to be able to go. I feel so privileged to have been working there. It's a combination of the biodiversity. It's so in your face in Galapagos. You step off the plane and there's sea lions in the street. Darwin finches sitting next to you as you have your breakfast. It's absolutely what you would imagine it to be from watching David Attenborough television programmes. But it is also a place where people live and work. And what's really nice is that those people have learnt really nicely to live in harmony with these animals. And because Galapagos doesn't have any land-based top predators, there are no mammals that should be in Galapagos. There's a few that are there that shouldn't be there, that are being controlled by the national park. But because of that, these animals have evolved without that fear. And so they will just come and sit next to you while you're having your breakfast. You know, like I say, the Darwin finches will come and sit on your table while you're having your morning coffee. And yeah, that's just an incredible experience. But also it's full of people who care about nature. And it's just, and most people that are in Galapagos are there because they want to see the wildlife or look after the wildlife. And so you're just constantly surrounded by these incredible people.
Is it a place that you'd say to anybody, not a scientist, that if you got the opportunity to go, it's one of those once in a lifetime places?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have to say, I was sort of sat on my flight in this year, sat behind a couple that were clearly going for their first time, and they had their brochures out and they were talking about what they were going to see. And I was just sat there behind them going, you're going to have the best time ever. It was so lovely to hear their excitement. Anyone who likes wildlife and cares about the environment would have their brains blown by a trip to Galapagos.
Oh gosh, I definitely need to go. I had my brains blown by a trip to Lewa in Kenya. It was the first time I'd seen lions and giraffe and elephants in the wild.
Very similar,
that's incredible. Yeah, life-changing.
It's a very similar experience. But I think in Galapagos, you have to get in the sea because it's like the marine equivalent. You just see so much. The second you put your face in the water, you'll see so many different things.
So does it matter if you're only a snorkeler and you haven't learned to dive?
No, not at all. Not at all. You can see so much snorkeling.
Wow, I definitely need to go. Let's just talk about acidification. I can't even say that word, acidification, very well. I know you're looking at that as well. Just explain what that actually is. I know it sounds like it's the ocean getting more acid, but what does that mean?
So this is all to do with the increasing amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We talked about the ocean taking up a big amount of that carbon. The carbon that the ocean takes up is in this form of carbon dioxide. And when carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, it becomes this quite weak acid. Now, our ocean is full of salts, of carbonates that buffer that. So the ocean has had this really stable pH. That's how we measure sort of acidity or alkalinity. It's been really stable for millions of years because of all these natural buffers that are in our ocean water. The problem is that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now overwhelming those buffering responses. And so the pH of the ocean is now changing. When we talk about that, we're not talking about it becoming acidic. So pH 7 is neutral. It's not going to go below pH 7. So it's still going to be slightly alkaline, but it's less alkaline than it was 100 years ago. And that small change in ocean pH is actually really important for an awful lot of the animals that live in the ocean that have calcified shells, which is a huge number of these marine invertebrates that I study. Their ability to make these calcium carbonate shells gets impacted by this change in ocean pH. And it's impacting all sorts of processes, not very strongly, but it all adds up over time. So we're seeing an erosion of any of these calcified habitats, things like reefs, coral reefs in particular. We're starting to see the impacts of this change in pH on their structures already.
And will it affect then crustaceans like crabs who make that shell for their home?
Probably things like mussels and oysters are more sensitive because they have this calcium carbonate shell. Crabs have a slightly more complex structure to their exoskeletons. They have something called chitin, which is a protein, which almost protects their exoskeleton a little bit more from pH than something like a mussel. But certainly coral reefs, mussels, oysters are really quite sensitive to these changes.
And you were studying all this when you were involved in the Catlin Arctic Survey, which was led by Penn Haddow and was about now, I'm thinking it was about 13 or 14 years ago.
Quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
2010, 2011 that we went off and camped on the ice to look at these processes underneath the sea ice. The Arctic is probably one of the most sensitive places to ocean acidification. Carbon dioxide dissolves into cold water more readily. This buffering capacity of the ocean that I talked about is lowest in the Arctic because it's surrounded by land masses with ice sheets on them that melt in the summer. So this fresh water input in that sort of summer melt season has kind of diluted that buffering capacity slightly. So it's got less buffering capacity and more CO2 in it. So it's kind of our canary in the coal mine, if you like, for ocean acidification processes. But obviously it is still covered by ice for an awful lot of the year. And so the Catlin Arctic Survey was trying to get some of the first under ice data on these processes to see what was happening.
Was it an incredible experience as well, being on those expeditions?
Oh, it was completely life-changing, both in terms of learning my own abilities and resilience, but also just learning so much about this fascinating environment. And it's another mind-blowing place I've been lucky enough to go. Arctic is actually really beautiful. We were mostly in an area just where we just saw ice and sky and not a lot of wildlife, other than the tiny plankton I was studying in the water under the ice. But every day the Arctic looked different, depending on whether the sun was up or whether there was a snowstorm coming in. There'd be all these tiny little ice crystals in the sky that made it look like rainbows everywhere. I mean, it's just so beautiful. I
was going to ask you what made you want to be a marine biologist, but you're painting a very nice picture. It's made me realise I've probably gone for totally the wrong career.
I think it's not quite as glamorous as it's. An awful lot of time is then spent in the lab staring down a microscope counting these things. But the occasions where you get to go out and immerse yourself in the marine environment are truly special.
And what was it then, Ceri, that when you were a youngster, can you track it back to something that inspired you when you were a kid that made you go down the marine biology route?
Well, I was lucky enough to spend most of my summers as a child in Pembrokeshire, in rock pools around Pembrokeshire, which is a very beautiful stretch of coastline. And I was always fascinated by the weird things you found in rock pools, basically. And I always wanted to know more about them. And I can remember a kind of a light bulb moment watching a TV program, which was about a marine biologist. She was actually studying the giant squid. And then she just had this piece to camera where she talked about how lucky she was to do this as a job. I'm like, you can do that as a job? Right. Okay. And so I decided then that I was going to try and make that my job, to study the things in rock pools that fascinated me.
And you can tell that you really enjoy the work that you do. I'm sure you get a lot of satisfaction out of it, don't you?
Absolutely. I'm very lucky. And what I love about academia is we get to ask questions and just follow our passions and figure things out. But then as someone working in a university where we also teach students, I then get to share that knowledge and communicate with the next generation of young ocean scientists and try and inspire them to care about these things as well. And that, I think, is one of my most favourite parts of the job.
Well, I was going to ask you actually about that, because you do a lot of outreach work with school children. In fact, I think you were up at Convex a few weeks ago doing some work on the Convex Seascape Survey with children. But why is it so important to you, Ceri, to get that research out there and to inspire young minds?
Well, I think David Attenborough said it best in that you only care about the things you know. And if we want people to take better care of our oceans, they kind of need to understand it a little bit more. And it was through working with Jamie Buchanan Dunlop, who runs Encounter EDU, one of our project partners for all of these projects, while we were in the Arctic, sat in our tent, where he explained to me how rare it was for anyone going through your education system in the UK to get marine examples of the key things that you have to learn in science and geography. It's entirely possible, even though we're a small island surrounded by coast, to go through your whole school education and just not know anything about what's happening in the seas around us. And so we decided, wouldn't it be cool if we could use this trip, this kind of iconic trip? All the photos look amazing. We're camping at -40 to try and understand these processes. That might sound interesting to people. Can we use this as a way of getting kids in classrooms interested in the actual processes that are happening under the sea ice or in our coasts around the UK? And it's been an incredible journey since then, developing schools resources, getting to go and talk to kids in classrooms about things like worms and plankton. And they will really quickly respond to these messages and get on board and start caring, which is really rewarding.
It's so important, and I'm sure children are very receptive to it. And it's nice to hear that they're learning some current things, because as a mother of a son who's just about to tackle his GCSEs, you look at some of the things they're learning and you think, gosh, I was doing that 50 years ago. Can't be 50 years ago, Ceri, because obviously I'm only 37. But that's the sort of thing I was learning. Well, now the world's a very different place, and it's important, isn't it, that all that information is current so that the next generation can help and get a healthier ocean going and be responsible for climate change and reduce their plastic use and understand why they're doing it.
Absolutely. And I also really think that understanding the process of doing science and kind of demystifying scientists and what we're doing when we're asking these questions is more important than it's ever been before. We now live in a world where there's so much fake news out there. Being able to critically evaluate the information you're giving has never been more important. And without understanding the process of science and what scientists do when we go out and ask these questions, that can be quite challenging. And so I think an awful lot of what we've been doing in this program isn't just sort of teaching the fundamentals of how the ocean works. It's also taking on a journey that the scientists are going on. And that's where expedition-based science can be a really powerful tool. You know, you get to see the journey of the scientists collecting the knowledge, turning that into understanding, and then sharing it.
Well, you're bringing it to life, which I think is really important. And you also regularly advise the BBC, don't you, on marine and plastic-focused programmes. Is that something you really enjoy doing?
Absolutely. It's always an honour when you get those phone calls saying, can you just tell us if we're saying the right thing on this programme? I've worked with some really fantastic researchers for the BBC's sort of natural history unit and the Blue Planet programmes. But what's really exciting now is that quite often those phone calls are coming from our alumni. So the students I taught marine biology to are now phoning me a few years later going, Ceri, I've got this job and I'm doing this programme. Can you give us a comment on this? So that's really nice.
And just a final word on the Convex Seascape Survey. How exciting is it being part of that, and how thrilled is the university to be part of it with Convex and also Blue Marine Foundation?
It's such an exciting project to be part of because it's brought together a really big team, and understanding carbon in the ocean is a big topic. It requires a big multidisciplinary team, and it's not often you get the opportunity to build these big, fantastic, inspiring teams of people asking different questions. So we're linking the work that I do in my lab, in my experiments, with people going out into the field, measuring carbon in mud across all sorts of different types of habitat on the bottom, working with big climate systems modelers who then put those numbers into their Earth system models to get the big global picture. That's a really exciting opportunity. But also we get to do it because of the way in which this is funded, is we get to really share this story and hopefully bring mud to life to this much wider audience.
Well, I think the next step for you and I, if I may invite myself, is I'd love to come and actually have a poke around in the mud with you sometime. I'm sure that's not the scientific phrase that one would use. But can I come and join you sometime? Just for pleasure, Ceri, and see you in action.
Of course, I'll happily get you to dig some worms with me anytime.
I'd love to do that. Thank you so much for making time for us and really for bringing all this to life. As you know, I'm a massive fan of the Seascape Survey, and it's been a privilege to meet people like you and Dr. Callum Roberts and George Duffield from Blue Marine. So keep on doing what you're doing, and thank you for being with us today.
Oh, no, thank you for sharing our work.
You're very welcome. You've been listening to Dr. Ceri Lewis, Associate Professor in Marine Biology from the University of Exeter, talking about her fascinating research with marine invertebrates, ocean acidification and our warming planet, as well as her involvement with the Convex Seascape Survey. And if you want to hear more about the survey, we have featured Ceri's colleague, Professor Callum Roberts, who's had a few shout-outs in this episode, and George Duffield of Blue Marine Foundation on the podcast, so you can look up those episodes. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search the Convex Conversation on Spotify or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another great guest. Join me then.